excited to kick off with the three of them. What we're going to do is we're going to spotlight each of the three of them to start, and I'll explain two things as we're doing that. One is that this structure is a kind of, I like to call it what do we call it? The dinner table dialogue. And so whether we're 3 people, 5 people, 7 people, what we try and do is really create a kind of a space for organizations and people to just talk to each other. So this is very natural, easygoing, and you as participants, we will actually have a space for you to also come in at a certain point and engage. So what we will ask is in chat, at a certain point, you will have at about 35 past, we will invite you to actually share some comments and reflections and questions that you have. So we like to do it this way because it gives you time to absorb, to listen. You don't have to be distracted by what's happening in the chat. But then at a certain point, we'll ask you to just throw everything you can into the chat, and the panelists will stop talking and just listen and read. And then they will come back and continue talking in response to what you've written. So what we encourage you to do is to write comments that you have, but don't press enter until Yan, my colleague, gives you the prompt to press enter in the chat. So what I'm gonna ask maybe, and Essay may have to have her video on and off because there's power cuts where she is. So don't worry, Essay, if you're not able to keep on video the whole time. But what I'm going to ask is for Claire, Essay, and Lior to unmute. And maybe, Lior, if you'd like to kick us off around the questions. I mean, today's guiding questions are what structural changes can funders make, but also what is the case? Why might funders want to invest in networks? How can funders think of the organizations and their work and the people they support as a network? And so we have a lot of guiding questions. So just start.
Yeah, happy to. Hi everyone. Lior with the Roddenberry Foundation. Big questions and lots of different directions to go in. I think for Roddenberry, the why, I guess, is, I think multiple reasons. The first is that the issues that we care about and the folks who are working to address them and the communities that they live in, none of it exists in a vacuum. It's all interconnected. So if we care about and are thinking about addressing those issues and thinking about impact, for us at least, it doesn't make sense to continue sort of the piecemeal approach that I think a lot of funders do take, and to start broadening and thinking about the networks and the ecosystems in which the leaders and the social change agents that we're supporting are a part of. That's one piece of it. I think the other piece is that as the foundation, we wanted to develop funding practices that were more inclusive of a more diverse set of actors, and investing in networks has allowed us to do that. Being more transparent and in how we do our funding is also a reason for supporting networks. When we take an equity lens to the work that we do, and so thinking about folks who don't traditionally have access to networks is an important piece of the work that we do. And so thinking about how we can find folks who are under the radar, so to speak, who are doing great work but aren't traditionally getting funded for whatever reason, is another reason why we think networks is an opportunity or a venue for us to find them and support them. And then ultimately, I think the why is that in supporting networks, in addition to individual organizations, I think at some point our intervention will probably end. And if we've done a good enough job of creating an opportunity or a platform for folks to learn and share and connect with each other, that will yield far greater benefits than any sort of short-term intervention, even a multi-year intervention that we have in the long term. So that's kind of our starting point for the lot of work that we do and how we think about the why behind networks. But happy to hear how my colleagues on the panel are thinking about this as well.
Go ahead, Claire, Essay, jump in, build on Lior, or share something else, whatever comes to mind.
I can go next, I guess. While I have light and this power. Hi, everyone. My name is Essia Mary. I'm with the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and I have the title of Global Network Weaver. The Global Fund is actually one of the only organizations that is focused solely on growing community philanthropy globally. Thinking about this as a central pillar for people-led, community-led development. It responds to traditional aid or traditional sort of development models or philanthropic models. And one of the central ways we do this with the partners that we work with as a funder. We begin every relationship by just, as it happens naturally, with a conversation and with the networks where we are. So we know that networks really only work when they are intentional and when they pay attention to the relationships that underlines all of it. And these relationships are fluid. So there are relationships within the network, relationships outside of it. But this all boils down to trust. I think in an earlier conversation we had, last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, trust really becomes the currency for how you engage with others. And trust for us is how easy information or knowledge it flows. The innovations happen naturally. It eventually leads to system or systemic change. So for funders, if we're thinking about why networks, this is naturally the next space where innovation and creativity and curiosity happens. And where for funders, if this is a space that you want to be in, is to really allow these natural ebbs and flows to happen. You have to be comfortable with not knowing from the beginning exactly how things are going to span out. You have to be comfortable with the idea that you have to give up some power. So there's this elements around shifting power or shifting mindsets that you wouldn't always have a pre-packaged, polished solution to a problem. That the solution needs to come from the ground up. It needs to come from the communities. It needs to come from the people, the networks that you're in. And in giving up power, there's actually a lot of freedom that comes with that. We can talk a little bit more about, what that, unpack it a little bit later on in this conversation, but I'll stop there so that Claire can jump right in.
Oh, I love everything you just said. I think both of the themes that you're raising are so important to the conversation. Is how do we as individual organizations with networks show up and think about our practices, our approaches, and our role in the space? How do we use our vantage? How do we think about the relationships that are across all of our different networks? It's interesting to be having the conversation now about this coming from the Skoll Foundation, as our network has really been very much at the DNA level of the organization. We have a model of investing, grant making directly with social entrepreneurs and innovators across the world in many different issue areas. We also have emphasized connection and championing the work that they do through storytelling and our network. So really just in the last few years, we've been learning how our network is one of our greatest non-financial assets that we can leverage to accelerate social change and to think about the broader tapestry that is behind a lot of what we gravitate towards talking about and reporting on, and thinking about in a, is this working or is this not? I mean, there's so many relational steps between and beyond and before and after a lot of the milestones that we often talk about in philanthropy. And so the space of networks gives us room to acknowledge the individual leaders, but also the collective spaces that we're trying to cultivate. And none of that's possible without trust and bringing a different orientation to our work, because we certainly don't have all the answers, and we're often the least proximate to the work that's rooted, that then can take shape throughout the network.
I think
I think I was going to say, based on go ahead if you want.
no, you go first.
I was just going to say that, what you hear and what I'm hearing is just this, that it does require a different mindset, right? That if you want to invest in networks and think about what that looks like as a funder, and this has been our experience with the Plus One Global Fund that we launched a couple of years ago, is that you have to shift your mindset some level and start, be comfortable with the messiness of network investment and the ambiguity that comes with it. You have to be comfortable with proximal leadership and want to support that. I think you have to be comfortable with trust-based philanthropy and that shift in power that Essie spoke about. I think a shift, as Claire mentioned, this idea of the soft power and what we can do outside of writing a check and thinking about the resources and the leverage and the place of privilege that as funders we come from in the space. All of that is a different mindset, I think, than traditional philanthropy, and I think it's a welcome one. I think more of us should be doing it. But it occurs to me that as we think about this, one has to think differently about the role of funders in this space and be okay with letting go of some of the power that we hold, and not only being comfortable but wanting to do that. And otherwise, I don't think this works particularly well. So. Just a thought that occurred to me as I was listening to Claire and Essie in this.
Yeah, I earlier this week, I think it was Monday, I was having a conversation with he's now turned philanthropist, or at least that's the title that he wants to now call himself. But he's based in the MENA region, comes from the oil and gas sector. And that sector is mostly risk averse, right? So it's, he wanted to have control. He wanted to make sure that deliverables or expected outcomes or outputs are done. And I think his frustration was around seeing lots of pilots being done around the MENA region and also down here in Africa as well. But that these pilots never scale. They never get replicated. It stops at the pilot phase and then you go somewhere else and you repeat another pilot. But like it doesn't, the ideas, the creativity doesn't generate beyond the pilot because money stops. Once the money stops after that pilot phase, nothing else happens. And in my conversation with them, it was interesting to get him or help him see beginning that conversation with money. Beginning this piloting phase or this partnership phase by focusing on money. Who's bringing the money? Who's bringing the expertise? Who's doing the capacity building? Who's identifying the partners? When you start a conversation like that, the power dynamics that are inherent in that space, whether it's subconscious or it's even realized, limits creativity, it limits agency, it limits ownership of community members to say that I too have an idea, or maybe that idea that you're suggesting isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z. But I think we still have a long way to go with new funders or philanthropists who still want to have control in some aspect. It's their money, right? It's family foundation or a private foundation that sometimes is doing this work, and they want to see impact. And I think that's sort of the rub or the tension. When you're working with networks, that maybe impact isn't going to happen in a 6 month cycle or a 9 month cycle, and having patience, like you talked about, having patience in that messiness, and trusting the process. You have conversations with good people who want to do good. Not everyone has a hidden agenda or a corrupt agenda to kind of hijack something. But when you trust that people are going to, when you lead with trust or lead with love, it's miracles happen at the end of it.
Yeah, I think also, when you enter with funding, that's essentially a transaction possibility. That's one of a whole spectrum of things that could happen through conversation. And we have been thinking a lot about the capital spectrum as well. There's social capital, knowledge capital, financial capital. What are all the different ways that we can add value? And I often find in talking with leaders in our network that are not funded by the foundation, but are certainly in orbit and doing incredible work, that often what they need is a connection, an access point, they need the door opened because they don't even know where it is. They're in the hallway, but it's hard to find because funders are often so cryptic and convoluted to navigate the spaces that we occupy. And that's on us to evaluate and improve and be more transparent about. But often it's just a matter of creating more accessibility and connection between peers so that the model can be refined, so that capacity could be built or partnerships could be made. And I think that could or doesn't have to include funding specifically, not to downplay the role of funding, but I think there's so much potential if we embrace the tension of control and centered focus in philanthropy and the organic open nature of networks. There's something in the middle where we could leverage both. So I'd love to just add in the thought that it doesn't have to be an either or, and that we often see our network as the accelerating force to an investment or the reason that we are then prepared to be an effective investor at that point. So many of our organizations that we work with in our school awardee community and our broader portfolios are people we've known for years, and we've connected or opened up other funder avenues, or who knows what shape it takes, but that our funding is only one way that we could be helpful in a given situation. And if we only talk about funding, or if we're only approached with funding, that misses out on a full spectrum of how we can help support the impact that's already happening.
If I may jump in for a moment, I think kind of listening to all of you, one of the things that I can see, Claire, you kind of started to touch on this, but one of the things I can see is a fear of kind of like giving up total control and giving up all power, which I don't think is what happens when you invest in networks. I think you give up some control, you give up some power, but you still hold power in a certain way. And I think it's also important to recognize what power you do and you don't hold. And I'm curious, kind of, maybe Lior, you could speak a little bit about this because you've been, I think, really experimenting around this. Where do you see kind of both the role as the philanthropist shifting in terms of not just where you retain and where you give up power, but also kind of what power do you keep? Because does it become more the power of weaving, or the power of listening and collaborating? Like what is the shift in power? It's not you're giving it all away, but what is the power that you're kind of maybe holding on to, or maybe even redefining what power you have?
I think being aware, just starting off point is being aware that there is a power dynamic, and it's unequal and unbalanced. Is I think more funders should embrace that reality. I think for us, we think of the programs that we've been running around these networks as, we have an opportunity with the resources we have to create what we hope to do is create an environment where the networking and the sharing and the learning and the potential collaboration, collective impact can occur. I think we generally, our starting point is that, if funders get out of the way, then the real work can happen. And so I think we try to take a sort of a gentle approach to it, and not be prescriptive or top down around this, and recognize that we do have access to resources and other networks and obviously funding that can be leveraged towards this that most folks don't have. And so how do we use that in service of creating an equitable environment where people can in fact be successful, and create one that's conducive for what we think is our healthy, vibrant, thriving networks or communities of practice. And so it is an ongoing challenge, and I think we're learning and we experiment as we go along. But that's sort of I think our philosophy or ethos around what our role should be. And I think that from a practical perspective, we do a ton of surveys, and we find out whether we're doing it well or not. And folks are very open to telling us when we don't get it right. So I think that as long as you don't make a mistake twice, that's our goal.
Could you say more about gentle approach, gentle facilitation? I'm not sure exactly how you framed it, but what does gentle mean in that context?
I think that it's, we on the one hand, we like to work with, so part of our network piece is the idea of investing in proximal leadership. And so when we think about network, whether it's capacity building or creating opportunities for folks to connect and interact with each other, we use local partners to do that. And we make sure that there's a values alignment in terms of their approach and our approach, which is to say that we see our role as facilitators, essentially, that we're not telling anyone what direction to go in or what they should be working on or how they should collaborate or any of that. And I think we try to really adhere to this role of sort of gentle facilitation and kind of setting it up so that people can be successful. And I think, to your point, Claire, the funding is only one piece of this, right? All this other, who we can connect people to, our social capital, how we leverage that in a way that is conducive to the folks that we're supporting, to their success, I think is an important piece to this. And so just being really mindful and aware of the power dynamic, I think, is the starting point for us.
I think for me, and maybe this is not a official professional opinion, but I think, for funders who are experimenting in this space, I have a bit of a radical sort of view, like, you want to fund, instead of funding success, right? Fund experiments that might fail and learn from that. I think we are so afraid sometimes we want to make sure that every dollar counts and that there's a return on investment, and you made a good investment here or you made a good investment here. But having stories where, okay, you tried something and it didn't work, but why didn't it work? And maybe even if you do the next thing, it still didn't work. There shouldn't be a straight path. There shouldn't be just one way of doing this. If we fund more failures, we get more answers, we get more experiments, we get different ideas. And it's that freedom of doing things differently. We shouldn't sort of limit ourselves to like, okay, this is a safe thing to fund. If it's a women's issue in a particular community, it's a sexy issue. It's everybody kind of will support that. If it's domestic violence, that's a safe issue to fund. But if you're talking about injustice and human rights issues and land grabbing and maybe sometimes political issues that get involved in that, funders shy away from that because it's a guaranteed failure, right? Somebody will be upset at the end of it. Not everybody will be upset. But so for me, personally, I'm like, fund those experiments or fund those opportunities where the answers are not easy to find, or maybe you just don't get an answer. You just learn that process didn't work, and so we can try another. So just fail fast and move on to hopefully a success.
Yeah, I think that part of what we're finding is that the general orientation that the foundation has long held around the importance of long-term core capacity funding, where we do not determine how the funds are used. Our measurements and our evaluation is much more at a systems level and an impact level as opposed to organizational changes. And that gives us a lot of breathing room. And so applying that, extrapolating that into network funding, we haven't specifically dug into it here yet, but I do think it's worth noting that there's levels of altitudes here. There's, how do we act as a network internally, externally, leverage our network? There are many, and increasingly so from our vantage, organizations that are using networked approaches to decentralize their own structures and scale their own impact or deepen their impact, or leveraging networks to achieve various types of impact. There's also the importance of funding networks that we do not control at all, in region networks or system specific networks, whether it be around climate action or, there's a lot of really extraordinary networks that quickly emerged or pivoted to respond to the pandemic needs in various communities at local, regional, and more global levels. There's also a space that's much more emergent that is important to name, which is that there's core support needed for people who are orchestrating networks for the sake of those networks and those ecosystems that may or may not ultimately specifically align to the needs that we have as a funder. And that should be okay. There should be space to let the relationship grow and develop, but also have core support for these networks to happen if we do believe that networks are critical to open access, increase visibility, make the, everything that goes into a strong system. Funding is just one part of it, but those localized networks are critical, especially from the philanthropy side, where often, again, we are not there. We are not building those relationships directly.
In just a few minutes, as most of you have seen on chat, we'll be inviting everyone to share your own ideas. So get ready to press enter, start typing. Before we do, for maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, there's so many things that have been thrown out there so far that I want to build on, and we'll still have 25 more minutes to do so. But I think one of the things that interests me is, Essie, what you were saying about kind of the failure and learning. And so there's a theme that I've heard you've talked about, is kind of being more willing to accept failure, to take on risk, and to allow things, I think, to go the way that they might go, to allow things to emerge, not have to plan and control and predict everything, because at the end of the day, I think the world has learned in the past 2 years that's impossible. That's not the way our environment, our human nature, anything works. But we tend to try and control and predict our development outcomes in a way that's contrary to nature. But I think the other piece that I think really interests me is the learning piece. And because you can embrace a lot of risk, you can embrace a lot of failure, but if you don't enable that to be turned into kind of a cyclical network-based learning approach, then it's almost useless. And so I'm curious if anybody wants to talk on how you can actually leverage the network to be a space for continued and deep learning and growth.
I think one way you can do this is by the types of questions that keep coming up. If people are asking questions, there is learning happening. If people are sharing information or connecting somebody outside of the network or bringing somebody into the network, there's learning happening. There's value, or somebody's seeing some sort of value in, hey, you should be in this space, or have you read this article, or I don't quite understand what this issue is. So if people are constantly, if the network is active in terms of curiosity, I think that's one way to mark that is successful, right? Or that is thriving, or that is being resilient and is being responsive to that. I think the learning aspect shouldn't also be something that happens only at the end or at the midterm. If you have like a time frame for how long this network is going to happen, most measuring and evaluation sort of activities tend to happen at the end, after the thing has done or is closed shop. But learning needs to be something that is in every conversation, in constantly even questioning your own perspective or biases, or what you walk into a room with. As a donor, am I right asking the right questions, or does everybody need to know that I'm a donor, or in the space that I'm in? If I'm walking into a space and it's all men, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm walking in as a woman, and that's a bias I might have, or automatic sort of response to that space. But I think it's the learning piece needs to be an active everyday or weekly activity that happens. That it shouldn't be something delegated to the end of the exercise, and that can be a way to check growth and a way to check impact and success.
I think you summarized it beautifully. So let's do this. I think in a way, Esther, your comment also reminded me one little thing you said about kind of, do I even need to acknowledge I'm the funder when I'm in the room? reminds me of a story about another fun philanthropist that we know who kind of, he's the chief executive officer of a fairly large philanthropic organization. They were investing in a network, and he went at the very local level and volunteered in doing the work on the ground, and nobody knew the power that he held in that situation. And it was his way, I think, to get a window into what is happening and what he is investing in. And so I think it's an interesting story because it brings up the power dynamics that are also there, but it also shows how we don't need to be so separate. You can find ways to connect, and those, I think the conversations we have about relationships and connections that we strengthen in a network also do apply to funders and how they can be embrace the same principle and really embrace kind of the relationships that they have. I want to stop for a moment. What I want to ask maybe Lior and Claire and Essay is to also think about, I think you all have some wonderful examples about how you've done this in practice, and it'd be nice after we take a break to hear a bit more about practically some things that you've done, as well as something we haven't touched on deeply yet is what shifts you've seen in your own organizations. What challenges have you faced? What challenges are you still facing? Because this is a never-ending battle. What challenges do you face with your board, your team members, yourselves, in figuring all of this out? So I'd be curious to hear more about that, but it's the audience's turn. So time for your input. As Yen shared, we're going to unspotlight the speakers, and I'm going to invite everyone while you're typing to also turn into your video if you can, so we can watch you. Everybody can we can put everyone in gallery view and we can watch each other typing. I'm going to put on some gentle background music, and just everybody share whatever thoughts, whatever questions you have in chat, and the panelists will sit there and read and pick out things that they want to build on after about 4 minutes time. So enjoy the music. Coming. There we go.
For next.
your comments coming for about 30 more seconds. Keep typing after the 30 seconds. In about 30 seconds, we'll ask the panelists to start again, and I'll start spotlighting them, and that doesn't mean you have to update. Lots of amazing questions and comments, and this is my favorite part of this facilitation process, to see the energy coming through. What do you want to build on? What did you read that you either want to respond to or that resonated with you? Anybody just jump in and go ahead and start. There's so much in there. We still are digesting and reading.
Great questions.
Suppose I should have left another moment or so. And while you're finishing reading, I just want to say maybe a bit of something I would say at the closing is, I think what's important is this is a conversation that is really the beginning. It's not the beginning, because thanks to Karen and Kirsten for also sharing similar conversations that you had with other funders about investing in networks. There's a few conversations like this that have happened recently, but not so many. And I think that our goal is that we can do a lot of sharing, a lot of kind of using the recording of this video just to kind of spark other conversations that we might be having with other funders, whether you are a funder, whether you invest, or whether you are a network. So just want to share that in advance of, I was going to share at the closing, but this is something that there's so much more that we can do beyond these 60 minutes, and I'm hoping this will really be a spark. But back over to you, whoever wants to jump in and respond to anything.
I guess I can jump in. I think just to address some of the questions around other funders and resistance, and this is just anecdotal, I have no data to support any of this, but we launched the Plus One Global Fund a couple of years ago, which is a funders collaborative, and it's rooted in the idea of networks and nominations within and amongst trusted networks and proximal leaders. And I think that what we found, there's a few thoughts. One is that there are other funders out there who are joining us in this process, and I think it starts with a place of aligned values, all the stuff that we've talked about. That is the easiest place to start when you have other folks who are interested in this, the idea of networks and believe in trust-based philanthropy and recognize the power dynamic, et cetera. All of those things, I think, is why they're interested. And I think anecdotally, we are seeing more funders going in this direction. I think there's a window of opportunity, post-COVID or as a function of COVID to think about systems and networks in a way that maybe they wouldn't have 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think that the resistance is the challenge, the messiness in this work, and the fact that there aren't easy answers, and that impact short-term, medium-term, long-term is harder to define. And what is, I think at this point, a lot of folks define network health in a lot of different ways, and it's just not as simple as writing a check and doing a report 12 months from now and seeing what happened, right? And so and I think that the easiest way to address that is to have more conversations like these, and for them to folks to see that the pool, the water's safe, and that while there is a greater risk in doing this, the reward is that much greater. And so giving folks opportunity, other funders opportunities to learn about what people on the ground are doing, what networks are doing, why they're important, why other funders are participating in this, more opportunities for funders to come together and collaborate, I think are all really important parts of this that need to happen more, and hopefully will, and might shift the conversation so that more folks involved in this.
I think for me, all of these are really great questions, and I'm trying to actually have a hard time picking the one to answer, but there are some clusters of groups, and I hope, Brendan, we can get access to the questions afterwards and maybe answer them one-on-one, or do a sort of, I don't know if it's a Google Doc, and we can just sort of insert answers there. But I think the questions around funding networks, or how do you practically fund networks, reminds me about the same questions around funding social movements, right? Because sometimes those are individuals, they may not have, they're not registered entities as per se. And I think in funding networks, usually there's a secretariat or a governing body or some sort of authority, or however they decide to organize themselves. There's usually a coordinator or somebody that is responsible for what happens within that network, is having that conversation with them. And maybe this is a space where funders can pool resources. That's one way to also reduce the risk, right? So it's not just one funder hoping that this network in Southeast Asia is going to miraculously be wonders, but it's having, pooled resources with a lot of funders that can experiment, and even having funders that may have no business even talking to one another in the first place. I fund women's issues, and I fund climate issues, so I fund, intentionally collaborating across sectors, across regions. Even it could be is another way to sort of support networks or reduce the risk in that. That's one thing that I probably would say about that.
It's a great point. I'd love to do a Google Doc, because there's a lot of specific organizations and case studies and examples that are coming to mind with a lot of these questions within issue areas. I thought I might respond though to what's been hard about building this and what barriers there are. We have found, and it's, I would say, just overall, this is an emerging space. It's an area where it's not clear to all audiences. It's an ongoing conversation about business case and uses and value add. And, it's been on our new team to really show how this work is not just complementary, but an accelerant to other more linear or clear, arguably tangible work. And key aspect that's been helpful for us is to show the long tail cultivation results of building our network and extending our reach globally through partners, many of whom have been networks, that 3-4 years later into the relationships of continuing loose ties, forming strong bonds, all of the things that go into network building, as many of you know and do in different contexts, is that we have been able to source many new organizations that we now invest in. And so as a mechanism, the network has been able to pull in new, proximate, community-centered organizations that we otherwise would not have met or known or had that kind of trust built. And by bringing them in, that ultimately is helping us as an organization live into our mission, achieve our vision, or move in that direction. And so I think starting with what funders focus on and the core primary role of getting capital out the door, making ongoing relationships so that the grants are made and sustained. Networks can be a specific tool to accelerate that and make it much more rich and dynamic. And so starting from that point, you can bring people into the more messy space of more ambiguity, more serendipity. And I think the role of spaces like this, whether they're online or in person, where we're getting people together and the work is more about curating who's there, or, focusing around a conversation versus saying, this is exactly what we expect to come out of that. Because I think it resonates personally, but then it doesn't totally follow through in a lot of our practices, which are oftentimes a bit more rigid than reality of how relational all of this work is.
That's very true. If I could make one prediction, I would say, and don't hold me to this.
I don't know, it's being recorded.
With this, I think networks could be, it's becoming the new kid on the block, right? So in all of these conversations globally around decolonizing aid or a pushback to traditional aid, grantees or organizations saying no to funders or donors and saying we want things differently. Funders are feeling like, there's a question about legitimacy. They still have money, they still have, or they want to still have relevance. Networks allows them to still have their relevance and still have the legitimacy. And so if it's no longer funding individual organizations and walking the path with them with core funding, then this is a space. Networks becomes that next space for experimentation and to say that this is, has funders, this is a space that we now want to build, in reimagining or rebuilding the aid system. Networks can be that, miracle thing or that catalyst that makes that development happen a lot faster. So for those who have questions around funding for networks, it's coming. I want to say that it's coming. Funders are going to be funding and they're going to be asking questions and identifying networks that are thriving. So one thing in terms of metrics or measurements is to ensure that your networks are asking questions. There are places that people want to be in. Funders it's a human nature sort of thing. Funders would fund what looks like it's cool, what looks like it's working, where people are asking the difficult questions, where experiments are happening on their own, and they just can support the process with that. So that's one thing to kind of do your due diligence in making sure your network is alive.
And building on that kind of that positive, I think this is a great way to close, and it inspired me to ask. We're about 60, 90 seconds before we're going to turn it back to the audience just for some closing comments in chat. If I could invite, I don't know if we'll have a chance for all three of you to do it, but at least two of you to share in 30-second bite an example of a network you funded that and what impact you've seen. Building on S's positive comment, just to leave us a sense of hope and energy and realness to all of this. Claire, if you want to start, if you can think of something.
Sure. We have been a longtime funder of the TEDx Global Network and have seen how, while many folks think of them as event curators, which of course they are, they're also connectors. And we've seen an extraordinary amount of new ideas, new community-based solutions and leaders come into a wide variety of networks. And we've just launched the TEDx Global Impact Network to specifically bring together local curators of people and ideas and connect them with sustainable development goals and impact. So an unlikely partnership of issue agnostic, locally placed folks that has been really inspiring for us, and a lot more to come.
Lior?
I think just to pick up on a point that you asked or made earlier, one of the cool things about the +1 Global Fund that we've been running is an opportunity to sort of get a bird's eye view of a certain sector in a certain part of the world through networks, and really being able to better understand who's doing what, who knows whom, how well they know each other, and what that network map looks like. And I think if funders are interested in addressing specific topics in certain parts of the world, there are fewer better ways than using and thinking about networks to address those issues, at scale with more significant impact. So it's been one of the cool takeaways for us.
Thanks so much to all three of you. As before everyone leaves us, what we like to do is ask you to share in chat one tiny thing that you might do practically in the next few months based on something you heard today. It could be talk to a funder about this, it could be explore something, read something, one tiny thing. And the reason we like to ask that is because, as I mentioned before, we think that this is we're hoping this can be a spark for a lot more of these kinds of investments in networks to happen. And we're hoping that the whole festival that we're running can, beyond May, lead to not just new mindsets and practices and behaviors, but also new connections and new collaborations. We're trying to use this space of Enact to be a space of network building and collaboration. And I invite all of you to kind of take a chance to just, there's a few more events later this week and next week around networks, but then we'll have everything in a recording. And the idea that was shared about having a Google Doc and that for us to kind of continue to build upon, that was an idea that we also had. And I think because there's energy around this, we will definitely do that for this session. So look out in your emails through the Eventbrite link. We'll be sharing that and hopefully have a way for us to continue building the conversation and answering questions. I want to kind of just, as you're typing a few things in chat, give a big thanks to Lior and Claire and Ese for your time. But more than that, for I think your willingness to experiment with this over in years way before a lot of other people were doing it. So for taking that risk. And as some of you know, before you close, we love to ask people just to unmute and say goodbye. And that's how we like to close. So before you click the exit on your Zoom screen, just unmute and say ciao.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Very much.
Great.
It has been great for sure hearing from here. Hearing from you.
Thank you.
I'm here in Kasese in the Rwenzori region, neighbor